So I want to now jump topics from language to education, partly because that came up in your reading, and I think there's some interesting things. It kind of came up both in your Hamilton reading and the chapter about YUPIAQ, Pathway to Ecology and Spirit, and so I think it's interesting. And I want to take a quote from the reading by Joan Pierre Raleigh Hamilton, and here's the quote. We are expected to improve ourselves by observing and listening in order to learn from elders. Life's lessons are best learned by observation. As we watch, she's talking about YUPIK and KWAGLEY life. As we watch, we are expected to continually analyze the activity. Elders then watch and guide our attempts to follow what we have learned. Okay, now as I'm talking, I want you to look for patterns in what she's saying. Okay, look for things that get repeated and things that are patterns. Okay, I'll go on. They evaluate us by stressing what was done right and what methods may improve our next steps. They emphasize that teaching is based on personal experience. We are also expected to help our families. We are also expected to help our families with daily chores and to contribute to the needs of the family, and are rewarded for doing this. Where did it go? Rewarded for this. Sorry, I lost my place. We are taught to welcome and be generous with all people, to respect belongings and all sources of our food. We strive to live well to reach venerated old age. We are taught that we are learned best when we maintain a balance of leisure, learning, and work, with work being our first responsibility. So what patterns did you notice? Take a second, pause the video, write down what patterns did you notice and what Professor Hamilton is saying here. Well, let me talk about a few things that I noticed. But before I do that, I want to point out kind of, sometimes we use the words of people. I think most of the time we use people's words to try to understand their culture. And when you do that, when you have something like a speech or an article or something that was written by people from a culture that you're not very familiar with, there's some ways you can use words to learn about a people's culture. And so I want to kind of talk to you about this as kind of a practical way, because there's a lot of what we talked to you about in this class that you probably won't remember after this semester's over, and that's fine and normal. But I want to maybe leave you with a tool in your toolkit that you, when you are maybe listening to someone speak from another culture, a way that you can learn more about that culture and make more of and gain more insight from their words. So the first thing is, I think it's always really helpful to look at repetition. What people mention many times during a speech or during something they're writing is often, not always, but is often a clue to those things that really matter to them, especially if they're talking about their own culture and they're repeating the same phrase over and over and over again. That's often a clue to what matters most. And so we're kind of values, right? And then also look for what I'm calling folk models. And what I mean by that is people's ideas of cause and effect, people's ideas of how things happen, what the world is like according to them, and how the world operates. And we can consider that kind of ontology, the what is. And then also look for the evidence they use. But what I mean by that is sort of, are people referencing science? Are people referencing traditional teachings? Are people referencing opinions? Are people referencing their own experiences growing up? What do they use as kind of evidence of what they're saying that might give you a clue within their culture to their epistemology, which means, in this context, what a culture considers to be reliable information, how a culture considers it to be that you gain information about the world. Those three things together, repetition, folk models, and evidence, are three good things to look for, partly because they point us to three much bigger things within worldview. So when I teach about worldview in different cultures in my anthropology of religion class, I like to talk about the tripartite model or three-part model of worldview, which is just my way of kind of making it easy to understand what a worldview is. Or maybe it makes it harder, I don't know. But the idea here is, when cultures have a worldview, that worldview has at least three things in it. What is, right? What is the universe made up of? Ontology. What is the world made up of? What kinds of people are there? What kinds of animals are there? What kind of world are we living in? Then you have your value system. What should be, okay, within the world as it is, what kinds of things are we striving for as a culture? And then how we know things, the epistemology. So, for example, for many Americans, part of the ontology is the idea of people that act in their own economic self-interest, and that kind of lies at the core of how we think, how a lot of Americans think that the economy works, and lies at the core of sort of how we sometimes think about what the best economic policies would be to sort of incentivize people. Also, sort of this idea of certain types of natural forces that are discoverable by science, which gets us into epistemology, right? So for many Americans, referring to scientific studies would be a common thing you would do in a discussion of policy. But then at the same time, so would be references to religious value systems, so would be references to personal experiences, lots of other kinds of epistemologies too. And then also in a discussion, an American political discussion, although people differ wildly on the policies they support, there are some values that seem to cross many groups, one of which would be, for example, freedom, and the idea that freedom is something that should be sought for and obtained. So cultures have an ontology, a value system, and an epistemology, and we can see traces of that in a people, in what they repeat a lot, how they talk about how the world works, and what they use as evidence. Also in the contrast that they draw between themselves and others. Of course, bear in mind that what people say about their culture is not necessarily always perfectly reflective of their culture, but this is just a way of sort of starting to understand a culture when you hear somebody from another culture, again, giving a speech, writing something, giving a lecture, in a video, in a documentary. Look for those repetitions, those folk models, those uses of evidence, those contrasts. So with this, let's talk first about, I want to talk a little bit about that thing that we just read from Joan Hamilton, and I want to ask you a question, which is, what do we learn from this about the YUPIK method of education? Just really quickly fixing my typo. We usually put the apostrophe there, and it symbolizes in the orthography or the writing system that we use for YUPIK that the P is a longer P sound than it would normally be held in other without the apostrophe. Okay, so what is the YUPIK method of education? Well, looking at this quote, let's look for folk models, which I've highlighted in green, aka ideas about how things work. And what we see is this emphasis on learning, and that you need to learn information, and that you learn by analyzing, that you learn through people teaching you, and that you're taught. And so this is a form of repetition, right? And it's also, so we're hearing learn, 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 taught, taught, taught. And it's also showing us kind of a folk model of learning where you learn through analysis, right? And through being taught. And we kind of see that especially if we look at some of these, again, kind of your folk model, some of these action words that are used to explain what the learning process looks like. Words like observing, listening, watching, working. So this idea that you learn by observing elders in the community doing fishing or doing hunting or doing weaving work, that you look at it, you observe it closely, and then you do it, and then you're gently corrected by them. They show you what you did right and what you did wrong. So it's this very much observation approach and then put it into practice approach. You also learn a little bit from this kind of about the value system of YUPIK education and YUPIK culture generally from this quote, with the repeated emphasis on elders mentioned 4 times, and then the idea of a venerated old age. So elders are something to be venerated, something to be respected and learned from. All right, so then we get this sense of sort of YUPIK education is very experiential, where people put into practice what they've closely observed, and so specifically what they've closely observed from elders who are highly valued for their knowledge. Now, in your KWAGLEY reading, he talks about a YUPIAQ, and he's Oscar KWAGLEY is a famous YUPIAQ author, and he talks about in the reading, he contrasts, if this is the right section of the book that you did the reading of, he contrasts the idea of that in, quote, what he's calling Western culture, there's often this emphasis within the education system on progress, and he talks about kind of contrast that within the YUPIK sense, this idea of integration with the landscape, the idea of spiritual, natural, and human realms taken together. And I think he does a good job of talking about that one's not necessarily better or worse than the other. He says that Western education for YUPIK people has had a number of benefits, including increased certain kinds of huge medical benefits, including lower infant mortality, has yielded some better transportation and communication systems, some food preservation benefits that have helped there to be a more stable food supply. He says there's definitely benefits here of the Western educational system, as well as kind of its fruits as far as the types of Western technologies. He says definitely. But at the same time, he says there's also huge social disruptions as well that came when people sort of had their traditional way that they learned things and their traditional culture values, and then in some cases were quite literally forced into Western schools, boarding schools being oftentimes in the earlier days, and then nowadays still in schools that sometimes don't, or heavily emphasis a non-YUPIK worldview. And he says, there's big social disruptions from that as far as substance abuse, as far as other kinds of social issues when kind of a people become disconnected from the culture of their elders and from the traditional way that things are done in their community and a way of life that's sort of well adapted to their community and to their landscape. There's social ramifications of that. And there's kind of a separation of things. So I want you to think now with that knowledge that we just talked about YUPIK education and kind of what KWAGLEY was emphasizing and what Hamilton was emphasizing. And I want you to compare that and think a little bit about Western education. And anytime I say Western, I kind of hate the term Western, even though some of our authors use it, because to me it's just way too broad. Like, I mean, are we talking about Western being like Western European influenced? Okay, so that's the United States, that's Canada, that's Australia, that's Western Europe, that's large parts of the Francophonic countries across the world, right? That's too broad of a term. So instead, I kind of want to be thinking of Western in this context as non-YUPIK education within places like Alaska that YUPIK people are being exposed to if it's not YUPIK traditional elder-based education. And so I want you to think about your own schooling and what that's been like. And it probably varies a lot, especially in a place like Alaska where we have a lot of educational freedom and differences and diversity. It may not always look the same. But one thing that you've probably noticed in at least some of your classes, and this class probably isn't really an exception, is what I call the DDB model, or the download and download back model. And what I mean by that is that the teacher, the professor, the instructor, shares information from their brain to your brain. She uses verbal and verbal and auditory methods like speaking at you, lecturing, or maybe a discussion, but where the instructor is still sort of leading the way, and then sometimes visual methods at all. But the goal, in many cases, is information download. That's not always the case, and especially as you progress further in your education into things like graduate school, or if you go into trade schools, it starts to look a lot different as discussion becomes a lot more important. But at least as kind of a dominant model for a significant part of our schooling is that idea of the instructor, she's downloading information to our brain. And then we show that we can download back by doing things like talking back or taking a test where we write back the information that we've received. So it's sort of a download and download back model. Again, it's an oversimplification, and there's lots of classrooms where that's not what it looks like, but it is kind of a common model that we see. And there's pluses and minuses to that approach when we compare it to the YUPIK model, where things were a lot more kind of hands-on and practice-oriented. So one of the pluses to a kind of DBB kind of Western educational model is you can convey a lot of information very rapidly, right? I can cover, for example, in this class, we can talk about 8 different major Alaska Native cultures. We can talk about ANTH. We can talk about the history of, hundreds of years of history of colonialism, and do all that within a semester. So you can convey a lot of information really fast with the DDB kind of model. On the other hand, that knowledge that is transmitted may not always be very well organized or usable in the brain of the person who's learned it. If you've downloaded all this information into your brain, but then you forget it, or what's more likely to happen is it's still there in your brain, but you don't really have many occasions to use it, or don't really remember that it's stored there deep in your brain. How much has it really affected your life, right? And so there's pluses and minuses to kind of this educational model. And of course, you know, this kind of educational model has produced brilliant scientific and technological minds and everything. And so I'm not trying to discredit it. Indeed, I often follow this model when I'm teaching. I'm just suggesting that, like any other cultural education model, every culture's got its way that it teaches its people, or its ways. And I think all of them have pluses or minuses. So these are some of the pluses and minuses of Western education. It can sometimes, in this kind of paradigm, be kind of detached from the sort of lived realities of it. And we try to get around that by doing kind of more interactive assignments, but oftentimes it is very sort of, let's talk about information in the abstract. Even if it's a concrete case study, we're talking about it in a classroom. Now, if you compare that to YUPIK models, what we're seeing is, among other things, at least what I see there, is a distinction between absolute and conditional knowledge. So oftentimes, depending on the field, especially if you're working in more hard sciences or engineering or things, kind of a distinction of knowledge is absolute, right? Kind of the point of scientific method. Obviously, it's always just our best approximation, but the idea is that we're getting at absolute truth. Whereas in YUPIK model, you're maybe talking more about conditional knowledge in the sense of sort of, I heard it this way. And you see that in the KWAGLEY reading, where he talks about sort of warfare songs and warfare practices prior to peacetime within YUPIK society, and he talks about a lot of these things as, well, these are very specific to my family, or I heard this specific song from this person, but I also know that they tell that story in this village. So kind of knowledge with a lot of contingencies on it, a lot of conditions of, well, it may not be absolutely true. Here's the people that are saying it's true. Also a distinction between correct information and correct application. So again, not always, but often in a Western educational system, we're sort of rewarding you for correct information, whereas in a YUPIK educational system, they're talking about sort of being rewarded for correctly doing things. And that's not to say you don't do things. So for example, I might ask you to apply a term to a case study and to see that you know the term correctly, but I don't like make you go out and do interviews. If I was going to kind of try to do the YUPIK educational system version of training an anthropologist, we wouldn't be doing this through Zoom at all. We'd go out, you know, into a community, and I'd show you how to do an interview with somebody from a different culture, and then you'd do an interview from a person of a different culture, and then I would kind of correct what you did right and wrong. So both of these are good, valuable ways of educating people, but they're different, and it's helpful and useful to understand those differences.